Sometimes the hardest thing in life is watching someone innocent suffer when you have the power to help. Sometimes it takes losing everything to understand what really matters. In the dusty town of Dustwater Ridge, a giant cowboy named Holt Granger walked up to a traveling auction. The crowd expected him to bid on horses or cattle. Instead, he shocked everyone by bidding on a scared little 5-year-old girl named Cassie. The townsfolk laughed at him. They called him crazy. They whispered cruel things behind his back. But Holt didn't care what they thought. Years ago, he had lost his own daughter at that same age. He saw something in Cassie's eyes that reminded him of his own pain. What would drive a man to risk everything for a child who wasn't even his? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind never stopped blowing in Dustwater Ridge. It carved lines in the faces of honest folk and scoured the paint from every building until the whole town looked like it had been weathered down to its bare bones. This was a place where mercy came as rarely as rain, and both were greeted with the same mixture of gratitude and suspicion. Holt Granger had called this unforgiving land home for the better part of 15 years, though home was perhaps too generous a word for what he'd built on the rocky outcropping 5 miles east of town. His ranch house sat like a fortress against the elements, built from local stone and timber that had survived more than one twister season. The structure reflected its owner, solid, scarred and standing despite everything nature and man could throw at it. The tarnished silver star tucked deep in his vest pocket told a story that most folks in Dustwater Ridge whispered about, but few truly understood. Holt Granger had been the territory's most feared bounty hunter for over a decade, a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. They called him Iron Holt in the wanted posters and newspaper accounts, not just for his unwavering determination, but for the cold efficiency with which he brought in his quarry, dead or alive. Those words had meant something different to Holt than they did to most lawmen. He'd built his reputation on the understanding that some men were too dangerous to bring back breathing, and the territorial authorities had been more than happy to pay his fees without asking too many questions about his methods. The badge in his pocket bore scratches and dents from bullets that had come too close, and blood stains that had never quite washed clean. But that was before Emma. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days ago, Holt's world had collapsed in the space of a single autumn morning. His daughter Emma, barely 5 years old, with her mother's green eyes and a laugh that could charm birds from the trees, had succumbed to a fever that no amount of money or medical attention could cure. Sarah, his wife, had left within the month, unable to bear the sight of the empty chair at their kitchen table or the toys that would never again know the touch of small hands. The ranch had felt like a tomb ever since. Holt had kept Emma's room exactly as she'd left it, her wooden doll sitting on the quilted bedspread, her picture books stacked neatly on the nightstand, her tiny boot still waiting by the door as if she might walk through it at any moment, asking for her evening story. Some nights, Holt would stand in that doorway for hours, remembering the sound of her voice calling him Papa and the way she'd run to greet him when he returned from long hunts. After Sarah left, Holt had thrown himself into his work with a vengeance that frightened even hardened criminals. The money poured in from increasingly dangerous bounties, men so violent and unpredictable that other hunters wouldn't risk the chase. Holt didn't care about the danger, welcomed it even. Part of him hoped that one day his luck would run out, that he'd face a gun faster than his own, and find the peace that had eluded him since Emma's death. The town of Dustwater Ridge had watched this transformation with a mixture of awe and unease. Sheriff McKenna, a decent man with more grey in his beard than he cared to count, had known Holt since before Emma's birth. He remembered when the bounty hunter had been merely tough instead of terrifying, when there had been warmth in his eyes, instead of the cold emptiness that seemed to stare through everything and everyone. Martha Donovan, who ran the only saloon worth mentioning in a 3-day ride, had served Holt more whiskey than was probably good for any man. She'd watched him sit alone at the corner table, nursing his drinks and staring at nothing, never causing trouble, but radiating a sadness so profound it seemed to dim the lamplight around him. Martha had buried a husband and 2 sons to the harsh realities of frontier life, and she recognized the particular weight of loss that bent a strong man's shoulders. The banker, Cornelius Ashford, had managed Holt's considerable earnings with the professional discretion that his position demanded. But even he couldn't help noting how the bounty hunter seemed to care less and less about the money with each passing month. The funds accumulated in his account like autumn leaves, impressive in their quantity, but seemingly meaningless to the man who'd earned them. It was this Dustwater Ridge, suspicious, weathered, and set in its ways, that had gathered on that fateful morning when the traveling auction rolled into town. These events came perhaps twice a year, bringing with them a carnival atmosphere that broke the monotony of frontier existence. Families would dress in their finest clothes, children would beg for penny candy, and the adults would examine the various goods and livestock offered for sale. The auction house was a ramshackle affair, more wagon than building, painted in faded red and yellow stripes that had probably been bright and cheerful once upon a time. The auctioneer, a thin man with a voice that carried like a brass bell, set up his block in the town square and began the proceedings with his usual theatrical flair. Horses went first, sturdy working animals that drew practical bids from local ranchers. Then came cattle, household goods, and farming equipment. The crowd murmured their approval or disappointment as fortunes were made and lost with the fall of the auctioneer's hammer. But it was near the end of the auction that the atmosphere changed. A group of children was led onto the platform. Orphans, the auctioneer explained, seeking employment and guardianship in accordance with the territorial laws governing such arrangements. The legal language couldn't disguise what everyone understood. These children were being sold into indentured servitude, their lives bartered away to whoever could afford their upkeep in exchange for years of unpaid labor. Among them stood Cassie. Though Holt didn't know her name yet, she couldn't have been more than 5 years old, with dark hair that hung in tangles around a face marked by hunger and fear. Her dress was little more than rags, and her bare feet were caked with the dust of countless miles. But it was her eyes that stopped Holt's heart. Green eyes, the exact shade of Emma's, looking out at the crowd with a mixture of terror and resignation that no child should ever have to wear. The bidding began at $5. Local ranchers called out higher amounts, calculating the value of small hands for delicate work and the years of service they might extract from such a young acquisition. The price climbed to $15, then $20, and Cassie stood perfectly still through it all, as if she'd learned that movement only brought pain. Holt found himself walking forward before he'd made a conscious decision to do so. The crowd parted around him. Even in retirement, his reputation preceded him like the shadow of a storm cloud. When he reached the edge of the auction block, he called out in a voice that cut through the morning air like a blade. $50. The auctioneer's hammer froze mid-swing. The crowd fell silent, then erupted in whispers and sideways glances. $50 was more than most men in Dustwater Ridge made in 2 months of honest work. For a child, especially a girl child, it was an unheard-of sum. $50, the auctioneer repeated, his voice cracking slightly. Do I hear 60? No one spoke. Who could compete with Iron Holt Granger when he'd set his mind to something? The hammer fell with a sound like a gunshot, and just like that, Cassie belonged to the most feared man in 3 territories. The whispers began immediately. What did a man like Holt want with a little girl? The implications made decent folks uncomfortable and gave the gossips ammunition that would last for months. But Holt paid them no mind as he counted out the money with hands that had pulled more triggers than most men had fired bullets. As he approached Cassie, she shrank back against the auction platform. her small body trembling with an instinctive fear that spoke of terrible experiences with large men and rough hands. Holt stopped several feet away and crouched down to bring himself closer to her eye level, making his massive frame seem less threatening. "What's your name, little one?" he asked, his voice gentler than most of the crowd had ever heard it. She stared at him for a long moment before whispering, "Cassie." "Well, Cassie," Holt said, extending his hand palm up in invitation rather than demand. "My name is Holt. I think it's time we got you home." She looked at his hand as if it might bite her, then slowly, carefully, placed her tiny fingers in his palm. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Iron Holt Granger, the man who had faced down the most dangerous criminals in the territory without flinching, guided a frightened little girl through the streets of Dustwater Ridge with the infinite patience of a father. The weathered wooden platform stood like an altar of human misery in the center of Dustwater Ridge's town square. Its boards had been stained by countless transactions, each mark telling the story of lives bartered away to the highest bidder. Today, it would witness something that would echo through the territory for years to come. Cassie had been traveling with the auction house for 6 weeks, moving from town to town like cargo in a merchant's wagon. She'd learned not to hope and not to cry because both brought unwanted attention from the men who controlled her fate. At 5 years old, she possessed a survival instinct, honed by necessity and sharpened by fear. The other children on the platform were older, boys mostly, their faces already hardened by experiences that had stolen their childhoods. They stood with the weary resignation of those who understood their place in the world's cruel machinery. But Cassie, small even for her age, seemed to disappear among them like a sparrow in a flock of crows. From his position at the edge of the crowd, Holt watched the proceedings with growing discomfort. He'd come to town for supplies and stayed out of curiosity, but now he found himself unable to look away from the child who reminded him so powerfully of Emma. The resemblance went beyond her physical features. It was something in her posture. The way she held her small shoulders straight, despite her obvious fear. The auctioneer, a man named Wickham who traveled the circuit selling whatever goods and people the law would allow, stepped forward with practiced showmanship. His voice carried across the square with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we now come to our final lot of the day. These fine young workers are seeking placement in Christian homes where they might learn useful trades and receive moral instruction." The euphemisms couldn't disguise the reality. Everyone understood that these children would work from dawn to dusk for years, receiving only basic food and shelter in exchange for their labor. Some might eventually earn their freedom. Others would simply disappear into the harsh machinery of frontier life. The bidding began with mechanical efficiency. Local ranchers examined the older boys like livestock, checking their teeth and the muscle tone in their arms. Bids rose and fell based on assessments of future productivity and the likelihood of escape attempts. The children stood perfectly still through these inspections, having learned that resistance only made their situations worse. When the auctioneer's attention turned to Cassie, the atmosphere shifted subtly. She was obviously too small for heavy labor, but there were always uses for nimble fingers and small bodies in the dangerous work of mining and factory operations. Her value lay not in her current capabilities, but in the years of service that stretched ahead of her. "This young lady comes with excellent references regarding her obedience and adaptability," Wickham announced, his voice taking on the practiced tone of a horse trader. "She's proven herself capable of delicate work and requires minimal supervision." Holt felt something twist in his chest as he watched Cassie shrink under the weight of the crowd's attention. She seemed to make herself smaller with each word the auctioneer spoke, as if she could somehow disappear entirely if she just tried hard enough. The first bid came from Jonas Blackwood, a mine owner known for his harsh treatment of workers. $5, he called out, calculating the profit he could extract from small hands in dangerous tunnels. 7, countered Mrs. Hartwell, whose laundry operation had been built on the unpaid labor of children too young to understand their rights. The price climbed slowly, each increment representing years of Cassie's life being bargained away. She stood motionless through it all, her green eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd, beyond the present moment, beyond hope itself. At $15, the bidding slowed. Most of the interested parties had reached their limit for such a young worker. Wickham raised his hammer, preparing to close the sale to Mrs. Hartwell, when a voice cut through the morning air with the authority of a thunderclap. $50. The hammer froze mid-swing. Conversation stopped. Even the horses seemed to sense the sudden tension that gripped the square. Every eye turned toward Holt Granger as he stepped forward from the crowd's edge, his massive frame casting a shadow across the auction block. The whispers began immediately, spreading through the assembled townsfolk like wildfire. What business did Iron Holt have with a little girl? The implications made decent people uncomfortable and gave the gossips fuel that would burn for months. But Holt heard none of it. His attention was fixed entirely on Cassie, who had turned to look at him, with those heartbreakingly familiar green eyes. For a moment, their gazes met across the distance that separated them, and Holt saw something flicker in her expression. Not hope exactly, but perhaps the faintest possibility that hope might someday return. $50, Wickham repeated, his voice cracking with surprise. Do I hear 60? The silence stretched like a held breath. Who could compete with such a sum? Who would dare challenge Iron Holt Granger when he'd clearly set his mind on something? The hammer fell with finality, and the transaction was complete. As Holt approached the platform to claim his purchase, the crowd's whispers grew louder and more pointed. He ignored them all, his focus entirely on the frightened child who now legally belonged to him. When he reached Cassie, he crouched down to bring himself closer to her eye level, making his imposing presence less threatening. "What's your name?" "Little one?" he asked, his voice stripped of the cold authority it usually carried. She studied his face for a long moment before responding in a whisper, barely audible above the wind. "Cassie?" "Well, Cassie," Holt said, extending his hand, palm up in invitation rather than command. "My name is Holt. I think it's time we got you home." The word home seemed to confuse her. She stared at his outstretched hand as if it might transform into something dangerous without warning. In her short life, hands had brought more pain than comfort, and trust was a luxury she'd learned she couldn't afford. But something in Holt's manner, perhaps the gentleness in his voice, or the way he waited patiently without pressuring her, convinced her to take a chance. She placed her tiny fingers in his palm, her touch so light it was barely perceptible. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Iron Holt Granger, the man who had tracked down killers and cutthroats across 3 territories, carefully guided a frightened little girl through the streets of Dustwater Ridge. His enormous hand engulfed hers completely, but his grip was as gentle as if he were holding a butterfly. The ride to Holt's ranch passed in near silence. Cassie sat beside him on the wagon seat, her small frame dwarfed by his bulk, her eyes taking in the vast landscape that would be her new prison or her new home. She couldn't yet tell which. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust, and in the distance, the mountains rose like ancient guardians against the endless sky. Holt found himself stealing glances at his unexpected passenger, noting the way she held herself ready to run, despite having nowhere to go. Her wariness was a living thing, coiled and alert, waiting for the first sign of danger. He recognized the look from his own mirror during the months after Emma's death, the expression of someone who had learned that safety was an illusion and comfort a trap. As they approached his ranch, Holt began to wonder what exactly he'd committed himself to. He was a man accustomed to solitude, someone who had built his life around the absence of others. What did he know about caring for a child, especially one so obviously damaged by her experiences? But then Cassie turned to look at him with those green eyes so achingly similar to Emma's, and Holt knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them. He'd failed to protect his own daughter, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could save this one. The spare room in Holt's ranch house had been used for storage since Sarah left. Boxes of memories he couldn't bear to open and furniture he couldn't bring himself to throw away. In the hours before bringing Cassie home, he'd cleared it out. With desperate efficiency, setting up a simple bed with clean sheets and placing a wash basin on the dresser. The room was sparse but clean, with a window that looked out over the eastern pasture where the morning sun would wake her gently. When he showed Cassie to her new quarters, she stood in the doorway for a long moment, her small hands gripping the frame as if anchoring herself against the possibility of disappointment. Rooms could be taken away as quickly as they were given, and she'd learned not to become too attached to temporary comforts. "This is yours," Holt said simply, stepping back to give her space. "No one will take it from you." She entered cautiously, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The bed seemed enormous to her, larger than any sleeping space she'd known in recent memory. She touched the edge of the quilt with reverent fingers, testing whether it was real or merely another cruel dream. From the dresser, Holt produced a wooden doll he'd carved years ago, a simple figure with yarn hair and a painted smile that had once belonged to Emma. He'd found it while clearing the room and couldn't bring himself to put it back in storage. "This was my daughter's," he said, his voice careful and controlled. "She would have wanted another little girl to have it." Cassie's eyes widened as she took the doll, cradling it against her chest with a tenderness that spoke of long deprivation. When had she last held something soft? When had anyone given her a gift that wasn't contingent on compliance or silence? The first days established a rhythm born of mutual uncertainty. Holt attempted to cook meals substantial enough for a growing child, though his culinary skills had atrophied during his years of solitary living. Beans and hardtack gave way to awkward attempts at eggs and biscuits, with Cassie watching from her corner of the kitchen as this giant of a man struggled with the domestic arts he'd once taken for granted. She ate with the focused intensity of someone who had never been certain when the next meal might come. Even with a full plate before her, she would glance repeatedly at the door, calculating escape routes and cataloguing potential hiding places. Trust was a luxury she'd been systematically taught to abandon. In town, the gossip mill churned with relentless efficiency. The church ladies, led by the formidable Mrs. Pemberton, clucked their tongues over coffee and speculation. What business did a bachelor, especially one with Holt's violent reputation, have with a little girl? The implications, they whispered, were ugly and persistent, fueled by the human tendency to assume the worst about situations they didn't understand. Sheriff McKenna felt the pressure of their concerns during his regular visits to check on the situation. He'd known Holt long enough to doubt the uglier rumors, but the weight of community expectation forced him to make official inquiries that embarrassed them both. "Folks are talking, Holt," McKenna said during one of these awkward conversations, his hat turning restlessly in his weathered hands. "I've got to ask, what exactly are your intentions with that child?" Holt's jaw tightened with suppressed anger, but he kept his voice level. "My intentions are to keep her safe and fed, same as any decent person would do." "I believe you," McKenna replied quickly, "but appearances matter, especially in a town like this. People see a man like you taking in a little girl, and their minds go to dark places." The sheriff's concerns weren't entirely unfounded. Dustwater Ridge was a place where reputation carried the weight of law, and Holt's reputation was built on violence and solitude. The townspeople knew him as Iron Holt, the man who brought back wanted criminals draped over their saddles more often than sitting upright. They didn't know the father who had once braided his daughter's hair and read her bedtime stories. Meanwhile, Cassie began her careful exploration of her new environment. The ranch house revealed its secrets slowly, the way the floorboards creaked. In certain spots, the places where sunlight lingered longest, the sounds that meant danger versus those that meant safety. She moved through the space like a wild animal, learning the boundaries of its territory. It was during one of these explorations that she discovered Emma's room. The door had been left slightly ajar, and curiosity finally overcame caution. She pushed it open slowly, revealing a space frozen in time, like a shrine to childhood interrupted. Toys sat arranged on shelves with careful precision. Books lay stacked on a small desk. Clothes hung in a tiny wardrobe, sized for someone who would never grow into them. Cassie entered reverently, understanding instinctively that this was sacred ground. She touched nothing at first, simply absorbing the evidence of a life that had been cherished in ways she could barely imagine. The room spoke of bedtime stories and birthday celebrations, of a father's love expressed through handmade toys and carefully chosen books. When Holt found her there an hour later, she was sitting, cross-legged on the floor, holding one of Emma's picture books and staring at the illustrations with rapt attention. The sight hit him like a physical blow. This dark-haired waif in the space where his golden-haired daughter had once played, reading the same stories that had once filled the room with laughter. For a moment, the grief threatened to overwhelm him. The similarities between the two girls were more than physical. Both possessed that quality of intense focus when something captured their interest. Both had the ability to find wonder in simple things despite the hardships they'd endured. But instead of anger or resentment, Holt felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, the possibility of healing. Perhaps Emma's room didn't have to remain a monument to loss. Perhaps it could become something more, a bridge between the daughter he'd lost and the child he'd chosen to save. She liked that one too, he said softly, settling down beside Cassie on the floor. Especially the part about the brave rabbit who saved his family. Cassie looked up at him with those achingly familiar green eyes, and for the first time since he'd brought her home, she spoke more than a single word in response. "Will you read it to me?" The question was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of trust beginning to form. Holt took the book with hands that trembled slightly and began to read, his deep voice filling the room with words that Emma had once loved. As the story unfolded, he noticed Cassie relaxing incrementally, her small body losing some of its constant tension. Outside, the wind continued its eternal song across the prairie, but inside Emma's room, 2 wounded souls began the delicate process of learning to hope again. The wooden doll sat between them, like a bridge across the chasm of their separate griefs, and for the first time since the auction, Cassie allowed herself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, she had finally found a place where she could stay. 2 weeks after the auction, Holt decided it was time to take Cassie to town for proper clothing. Her ragged dress had been patched and cleaned, but it was clearly inadequate for the approaching winter months. She needed sturdy shoes, warm clothes, and the basic necessities that would help her transition from survival to something approaching childhood. The decision to venture into town together wasn't made lightly. Holt understood the gauntlet of stares and whispers they would face, but Cassie's needs outweighed his discomfort with public scrutiny. He helped her climb onto the wagon seat beside him, noting how she'd grown less skittish around him, but remained hyper-vigilant about their surroundings. The ride to Dustwater Ridge passed in companionable silence. Cassie had begun to relax during their daily routines, though she still startled at sudden movements and watched the horizon constantly for signs of danger. Her survival instincts had been honed by experiences that no child should endure, creating habits that would take time and patience to overcome. As they entered the town's main street, Holt felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning their direction. Conversations paused mid-sentence as neighbors caught sight of the unlikely pair. The giant bounty hunter and the waif-like child made for compelling gossip, and the townspeople weren't subtle in their curiosity. At Peterson's general store, the owner's wife served them with barely concealed disapproval. Mrs. Peterson had always been a proper woman who valued appearances over substance. and the sight of Holt shopping for children's clothing confirmed her worst suspicions about his motives. But Cassie's reaction to having choices, real choices about what she wore and what she needed, transformed the uncomfortable shopping expedition into something approaching magical. She stood transfixed before a display of children's shoes, her small fingers tracing the leather with reverent wonder. "Which ones do you like?" Holt asked, crouching down to her eye level. She pointed tentatively at a pair of simple brown boots, sturdy and practical but well-made. When Holt nodded his approval and asked Mrs. Peterson to measure Cassie's feet, the child's eyes widened with disbelief. Shoes that fit properly were a luxury she'd never experienced. The measuring process revealed feet marked by neglect and hardship, calluses from walking on rough ground, scars from inadequate protection, nails that needed careful trimming. Mrs. Peterson's expression softened slightly as she worked, her maternal instincts momentarily overriding her suspicions about Holt's character. "These should do nicely," she said, helping Cassie into the boots. "How do they feel, child?" "Like walking on clouds," Cassie whispered, taking her first tentative steps in properly fitted footwear. The simple pleasure in her voice cut through the store's tension like sunlight through storm clouds. They continued shopping with methodical care, warm dresses for winter, undergarments, a heavy coat that would protect her from the prairie winds. With each purchase, Cassie seemed to grow a little taller, a little more substantial, as if proper clothing was helping her remember that she deserved to take up space in the world. The transformation didn't go unnoticed by other customers in the store. A few children pressed their faces against the windows, curious about the girl they'd heard so much about but had never actually seen. Their parents quickly pulled them away, but not before Cassie caught glimpses of their interest. It was during their final stop at the pharmacy that the first words of genuine gratitude emerged. Holt had selected a gentle soap and a brush for her tangled hair, items that spoke to dignity and self-care rather than mere survival. "Thank you, mister," Cassie said quietly, the words barely audible above the store's ambient noise. They were the first unprompted words she'd spoken to him, and they carried the weight of trust beginning to form. Holt felt something tight in his chest, loosen slightly, a sensation he'd almost forgotten was possible. Back at the ranch, their evening routine had evolved into something approaching family life. Holt would prepare their simple dinner while Cassie arranged her new belongings with the careful precision of someone who had learned to value possessions. The wooden doll Emma had cherished now sat prominently on Cassie's windowsill, no longer a reminder of loss, but a symbol of continuity and care. As autumn deepened into the promise of winter, Holt began teaching Cassie basic skills that would serve her well. Letters came first, the alphabet traced in the dust of the kitchen table, then practiced with charcoal on scraps of paper. Emma's primers proved invaluable, their simple lessons designed for young minds eager to learn. Cassie absorbed knowledge with the hungry intensity of someone who understood its value. She'd seen how ignorance made people vulnerable, how those who couldn't read or write became easy prey for those who could. Education represented power and protection, concepts she grasped with wisdom beyond her years. The nightmares came without warning, usually in the dark hours before dawn. Holt would wake to the sound of muffled crying from Cassie's room, her small voice calling out for people who would never answer. During these episodes, he would sit outside her door, his presence a barrier between her dreams and reality, waiting patiently for the terror to pass. Sometimes she would wake fully and find him there, his massive frame somehow comforting rather than threatening in those vulnerable moments. He never pressed her for details about what frightened her, understanding instinctively that healing couldn't be rushed or forced. One particularly difficult night, when the nightmares seemed especially vivid, Cassie emerged from her room clutching Emma's wooden doll. She found Holt sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee and staring into the darkness beyond the windows. "Can't sleep either?" he asked gently. She shook her head and climbed onto the chair beside him, still small enough that her feet didn't touch the floor. They sat together in comfortable silence, two souls bonded by their understanding of loss and their tentative hope for healing. It was during one of these quiet moments that Reverend Michaels chose to make his unannounced visit. The preacher arrived with the self-righteous certainty of someone convinced he was doing God's work. His questions about Holt's Christian intentions thinly veiled accusations about impropriety. But Cassie, despite her youth and limited experience with adult conflicts, recognized the threat the preacher represented. Without prompting, she moved closer to Holt's chair and spoke with a clarity that surprised them both. "He takes care of me," she said firmly, her green eyes meeting the preacher's gaze without flinching. "He reads me stories and makes sure I'm not hungry. Papa says families take care of each other." The word papa hung in the air like a benediction, transforming the kitchen's atmosphere from accusation to something approaching sacred. Even Reverend Michaels seemed taken aback by the child's simple faith in her protector. As the preacher departed with his concerns unanswered but his suspicions somewhat allayed, Holt realized that Cassie had just defended him with the same fierce loyalty he'd been developing for her. They were becoming something neither had dared hope for, a family forged not by blood, but by choice and mutual protection. 3 months had transformed both the ranch and its inhabitants in ways that surprised even Holt. Cassie had grown sturdy and confident under his care, her hollow cheeks filling out and her eyes losing some of their constant wariness. The change was most evident in the mornings when she would emerge from her room without the defensive posture that had once defined her every movement. The daguerreotype of his former family, himself, Sarah, and baby Emma, sat on his dresser like a window into another life. Holt found himself looking at it more often lately, not with the crushing grief that had once accompanied every glance, but with something approaching acceptance. The fear of loving again, of replacing Emma's memory with new affection, had begun to ease as he understood that the heart's capacity for love was not diminished by sharing it. Teaching Cassie to ride had become their morning ritual. The gentle mare he'd selected for the purpose, a patient brown horse named Belle, seemed to understand the precious nature of her young rider. Cassie approached each lesson with the focused determination that characterized everything she do, her small hands learning to hold the reins with confidence rather than fear. "Remember to keep your heels down," Holt called out as Cassie guided Belle around the corral. "Let her know you're in charge, but don't fight her. A good horse wants to do right by you if you treat her fair." The parallel wasn't lost on either of them. Trust, once broken, required patience and consistency to rebuild. Both horse and rider were learning to believe in the possibility of partnership without fear. Cassie's natural intelligence had become increasingly evident as their educational sessions progressed. She absorbed letters and numbers with startling speed, moving from basic recognition to simple reading within weeks. Emma's primers, once gathering dust on forgotten shelves, now showed the wear of daily use as Cassie worked through their lessons with methodical precision. "Sound it out," Holt would encourage when she encountered unfamiliar words. "Take your time, there's no rush." But Cassie approached learning with the urgency of someone who understood that knowledge represented freedom. She'd seen how ignorance made people vulnerable to exploitation, how those who couldn't read contracts or understand numbers became easy prey for the unscrupulous. Education was armor against a world that showed little mercy to the helpless. Martha Donovan had emerged as an unexpected ally in their unconventional family arrangement. The saloon owner possessed the practical wisdom of someone who had survived her own share of hardships, and she recognized genuine care when she saw it. Her visits to the ranch had become regular occurrences, bringing fresh bread and feminine perspective to a household that had been thoroughly masculine for too long. "That child's blooming like a flower after rain," Martha observed during one of her visits, watching Cassie practice her letters at the kitchen table. "Whatever you're doing, Holt, it's working." Her endorsement carried weight in a community where opinions formed quickly and changed slowly. Martha's reputation for straight talk and moral integrity made her support valuable currency in the court of public opinion. But not everyone shared Martha's charitable view of the situation. The town council had been meeting with increasing frequency, ostensibly to discuss various municipal matters, but actually to debate what they perceived as the Granger problem. Led by Cornelius Ashford and supported by the more conservative church members, a faction had emerged that viewed Holt's guardianship as inappropriate and potentially scandalous. "It's not natural," Mrs. Pemberton declared during one of these gatherings. "A man like that, living alone with a little girl. People are starting to talk." Judge Harrison, the territorial magistrate who visited Dustwater Ridge monthly to handle legal matters, had been quietly investigating the situation. His inquiries were diplomatic but persistent, focusing on the legal and moral aspects of Holt's informal adoption of Cassie. The pressure reached Holt through Sheriff McKenna, who delivered the council's concerns with obvious reluctance. "They're asking questions I can't ignore," McKenna explained during a particularly uncomfortable conversation. "About your legal right to the child, about whether proper procedures were followed." Holt's jaw tightened with controlled anger. "I paid for her fair and square. The transaction was legal. Buying a child isn't the same as adopting one," McKenna replied carefully. "The council's worried about appearances, about what it means for the town's reputation if word spreads about the arrangement." These external pressures created an undercurrent of tension that Cassie was too perceptive to miss entirely. She began to notice the way conversations stopped when she and Holt entered the general store, the sideways glances that followed them during their rare trips to town. Her hard-earned sense of security started to show small cracks as she overheard fragments of whispered conversations. It was during one of these town visits that she first heard the cruel speculation about Holt's motives. Hidden behind a display of dry goods, while Holt conducted business with the pharmacist, she listened to two women discuss her situation with the casual cruelty that passed for concern in small communities. "Mark my words," one said to the other. "No good will come of this arrangement. Men like that don't take in little girls out of Christian charity." The words hit Cassie like physical blows, confirming fears she'd been trying to suppress. Was she wrong to trust Holt? Were the feelings of safety and belonging she'd begun to experience merely illusions that would be shattered when his true intentions revealed themselves? That evening, as they sat together reading by lamplight, Cassie found herself studying Holt's profile with new uncertainty. The large hands that had always been gentle with her suddenly seemed potentially threatening. The voice that read her bedtime stories now carried undertones she'd never noticed before. Holt, sensing her withdrawal, looked up from the book they'd been sharing. "Something troubling you, little one?" The question hung between them like a bridge. She wasn't sure she dared cross. Trust, once questioned, became fragile as spun glass. But the genuine concern in his eyes reminded her of all the evidence that contradicted the town's ugly whispers. The patient way he taught her letters, the care he took with her nightmares, the tears she'd seen him shed when he thought she wasn't. "Looking, people say mean things," she said finally, her voice small but determined. "About why you took me." Holt set down the book and turned to face her fully, his expression serious but not defensive. "What kind of mean things?" "That men like you don't help little girls unless they want something bad." The pain that crossed his features was so genuine that Cassie immediately regretted bringing up the subject. But Holt reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose, and gently touched her hand. "Cassie," he said, his voice steady. Despite the emotion, she could hear beneath the words, "I took you because you reminded me of my Emma, and because no child should be sold like cattle. I keep you because you've become precious to me, like a daughter. If anyone ever tries to tell you different, you come straight to me. Can you do that?" She nodded, the knot of fear in her chest loosening slightly, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and they both knew that the outside world would continue to test the bonds they were building. The telegram that arrived the next morning would prove just how prophetic that fear would turn out to be. The drawing appeared on Holt's dresser one morning, like a small miracle rendered in charcoal and childish hope. Cassie had worked on it secretly during the quiet hours when he tended to the animals, her tongue poking out in concentration as she struggled to capture something important on the precious paper he'd given her for practice. The artwork was simple but unmistakably heartfelt. Two figures standing beside a house, one large and one small, holding hands beneath a sun that took up nearly a quarter of the page. At the bottom, in carefully formed letters that spoke of hours of practice, she had written, "Me and Papa Holt." The word Papa hit him like a physical force, stealing his breath and bringing tears to eyes that had grown accustomed to dryness. He stood there holding the drawing with hands that trembled slightly, overcome by the realization that somewhere in the process of caring for Cassie, she had begun to see him as a father. When she found him looking at the picture, her face flushed with sudden uncertainty. "Do you like it?" she asked, her voice small and anxious. "I love it," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. "It's the most beautiful thing anyone's ever made for me." Her smile in response was radiant, transforming her face into something that reminded him powerfully of Emma's joy during her rare moments of pure happiness. But beneath his gratitude lay a complex web of emotions. Guilt at the thought of replacing Emma's memory, fear of failing another child who had come to depend on him, and a fierce protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. Sheriff McKenna's visit that afternoon carried ominous undertones that couldn't be disguised by his apologetic manner. The lawman had always been fair in his dealings with Holt, but the pressure from the town council was becoming impossible to ignore. "Judge Harrison's been asking pointed questions," McKenna explained, his hat turning restlessly in his weathered hands, "about the legality of your guardianship, about whether proper procedures were followed. The council's pushing him to investigate." "Formally?" Holt felt ice forming in his chest. "What kind of investigation?" "The kind that could result in Cassie being removed from your care and placed elsewhere. There are families in town who've expressed interest in taking her in, families that the judge might consider more appropriate." The threat was clear, and Holt's mind immediately began calculating responses. His bounty hunting days had taught him to plan for worst-case scenarios, but this was different. Violence couldn't solve the problem of legal proceedings and social disapproval. That evening, Cassie sensed the tension that hung over the ranch like an approaching storm. Her survival instincts, honed by years of uncertainty, picked up on subtle changes in Holt's manner and the way he kept glancing toward town as if expecting unwelcome visitors. "Are you going to send me away?" she asked during their usual reading time, her voice carefully controlled in the way of children who had learned that emotional displays could be dangerous. The question broke Holt's heart. "Never," he said firmly, setting aside the book to give her his full attention. "I will never send you away, Cassie. You're my family now." But even as he spoke the words, they both understood that his intentions might not be enough to protect what they'd built together. The adult world operated by rules that didn't always account for love or genuine care, and those rules were beginning to close in around them. The next morning brought Martha Donovan with fresh bread and the kind of practical wisdom that had carried her through decades of frontier hardship. She listened to Holt's concerns about the investigation with the focused attention of someone who understood the stakes involved. "You need to make this official," she told him bluntly. "All this informal arrangement does is give your enemies ammunition. Adopt her proper, through the courts, with all the legal papers that'll make her truly yours. And if Judge Harrison won't approve it, then we make sure he understands the alternatives," Martha replied grimly. "That child's thriving under your care in ways anyone with eyes can see. Sometimes judges need reminding about what's actually in a child's best interests." Meanwhile, Cassie had begun absorbing the practical skills that would serve her throughout her life. Cooking lessons took place in the kitchen, where she learned to manage the temperamental stove and gauge the doneness of bread by sound and smell. Garden work taught her about the patience required to nurture growing things, while animal care showed her how gentleness could coexist with firmness. But it was during one of these routine activities that the first overt threat materialized. Cassie was feeding the chickens behind the house when she overheard two men talking near the front porch. Hidden by the hen house, she listened with growing alarm as they discussed her future with the casual detachment of people arranging a business transaction. "The judge wants to see the girl placed with a proper family," one voice said. "The Hartwell woman's put in a formal request to take her in." Cassie's blood turned to ice water. Mrs. Hartwell ran the laundry operation where children worked 16-hour days in conditions that destroyed their health and spirit. The prospect of being handed over to that woman felt like a death sentence of a different kind. When the men departed, Cassie remained hidden until she was certain they were gone. Then she ran to find Holt, her careful composure finally cracking under the weight of terror that had become all too familiar. He found her in Emma's room, clutching the wooden doll and crying with the desperate intensity of someone who had briefly tasted safety only to feel it slipping away. Without hesitation, he gathered her into his arms, his large frame enveloping her small one like a shield against the world's cruelty. "I heard them," she sobbed against his chest. "They want to give me to Mrs. Hartwell. Please don't let them. Don't take me, Papa, please." The word Papa, spoken in desperation rather than affection, cut through Holt's heart like a blade. This child had called him father, not out of sentiment, but out of the primal need for protection that connected all living things to their guardians. "They won't take you," he promised, his voice carrying the steel of absolute certainty. "I swear, on Emma's memory, they will not take you from me." As he held Cassie while her tears gradually subsided, Holt made a decision that would change the trajectory of both their lives. The time for passive resistance had ended. If the law wanted to challenge his right to protect this child, he would meet that challenge with every resource at his disposal. But first, he needed to understand exactly what they were up against. The telegram that had been burning a hole in his pocket for 2 days suddenly seemed less important than the immediate threat of legal intervention. Whatever Cassie's past held, it would have to wait until he'd secured her future. Outside, the wind carried the scent of approaching winter, and with it, the promise that the season of testing had only just begun. The fever came without warning, striking Cassie down with the sudden violence of prairie lightning. One morning, she was her usual alert self, helping with breakfast and chattering about the stories they'd read the night before. By evening, she was burning with heat that no amount of cool cloths could ease, her small body racked with chills that made her teeth chatter uncontrollably. Holt's panic was immediate and overwhelming. The sight of Cassie lying unconscious in her bed, her face flushed and her breathing labored, catapulted him back to those terrible final days with Emma. He'd been helpless then, watching his daughter slip away despite every prayer and medical intervention money could buy. The prospect of losing another child to illness felt like divine punishment for sins he couldn't name but somehow deserved. Dr. Whitmore arrived within the hour, his medical bag clutched tight against the urgency of the situation. The elderly physician had delivered most of the children in Dustwater Ridge and seen too many of them buried before their time. His examination of Cassie was thorough and gentle, his weathered hands probing for clues to her condition with the practiced efficiency of decades. "She needs to be undressed so I can examine her properly," Dr. Whitmore said quietly. "Sometimes these frontier fevers leave marks that can help with diagnosis." Holt stepped out of the room while the doctor worked, pacing the kitchen with the restless energy of a caged animal. Through the thin walls, he could hear Dr. Whitmore's quiet exclamations and the rustle of bedsheets. When the examination concluded, the physician emerged with an expression that mixed professional concern with something approaching horror. "Holt," Dr. Whitmore said carefully, "I need you to sit down." The words carried ominous weight. Holt remained, standing, his body tense with anticipation of news he wasn't sure he could bear to hear. "She's going to recover from the fever," the doctor continued, "but I found something during the examination that changes everything. There's a brand mark on her shoulder, a crude iron burn that's been deliberately inflicted." The words hit Holt like physical blows. "A brand, like they use on cattle," Dr. Whitmore confirmed grimly. "Someone marked that child like she was livestock. I've seen similar marks before, Holt, though I've tried to pretend I hadn't. There's been talk for years about children disappearing from the outer settlements, about organized groups that traffic in human cargo. The branded iron, that cruel marking tool that reduced human beings to property, became the key that unlocked a puzzle Holt had been unconsciously assembling for months. Cassie's hypervigilance, her survival instincts, her terror of authority, figures all suddenly made terrible sense. She hadn't simply been orphaned and sold at auction. She'd been systematically processed by an organization that treated children as renewable resources. As Dr. Whitmore continued his explanation, the full scope of what Cassie had endured began to emerge. The auction house where Holt had found her wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger network that moved children between territories like merchants trading in any other commodity. The brand served as both identification and ownership marker, ensuring that property could be tracked and reclaimed if necessary. "I should have spoken up years ago," Dr. Whitmore admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "I've treated other children with similar marks, always told myself it wasn't my place to ask questions. But seeing it on that little girl upstairs, knowing how much she means to you, I can't stay silent anymore." While Cassie drifted in and out of feverish sleep, her unconscious murmurs revealed fragments of memories she'd been too traumatized to share while awake. She spoke of other children, of places where small hands were valued for dangerous work in mines and factories, of adults who viewed them as disposable tools rather than human beings. But it was her fevered mention of Emma's name that stopped. Holt's heart entirely, "The sick one," Cassie mumbled through her delirium. "They said the sick one's papa would come for them all if he knew. Had to keep moving so the papa wouldn't find us." The words were fragmented and unclear, but they planted a terrible seed of suspicion in Holt's mind. Emma had fallen ill so suddenly, her condition deteriorating with an almost unnatural speed. The doctors had called it fever, blamed it on the harsh climate and the isolation of frontier life. But what if there had been another explanation? Dr. Whitmore's expression grew increasingly troubled as he listened to Cassie's feverish confessions. "Holt," he said quietly, "I think your Emma might have been targeted by the same people who took Cassie." The revelation hit like lightning, illuminating connections that had been hidden in shadow. Emma's mysterious illness, the strange men who had been seen near their ranch in the weeks before she took sick, the way her condition had resisted every treatment. What if it hadn't been natural causes at all? "You're saying they poisoned my daughter?" Holt's voice was deadly quiet, the tone that had once made hardened criminals reconsider their life choices. "I'm saying the timing and symptoms match what I've seen in other cases where the trafficking network wanted to eliminate potential obstacles. Your reputation as a bounty hunter made you dangerous to their operations. A grieving father, consumed by loss, would be much less likely to notice children disappearing from the area." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Emma hadn't died from random illness. She'd been murdered to neutralize her father's potential threat to a criminal enterprise that profited from stolen childhoods. The grief that had consumed Holt for 3 years transformed into something far more dangerous, a cold, calculating fury that promised consequences measured in blood. As if summoned by the weight of these revelations, Sheriff McKenna appeared at the kitchen door with news that completed the terrible picture. "Got a telegram this morning," he said grimly, "from the Territorial Marshal's office. Seems there's been inquiries about a girl matching Cassie's description. Someone's looking for their lost property." The telegram crackled with implications. As McKenna read its contents aloud, a legitimate business concern was seeking the return of contracted workers who had been irregularly transferred at recent auctions. The legal language couldn't disguise what everyone now understood. Cassie's former captors were coming to reclaim what they considered their property. "How long do we have?" Holt asked, his mind already shifting into the tactical planning mode. That had made him such an effective hunter. Maybe a week, possibly less. The marshal's office is treating this as a civil matter for now, but that could change quickly if the wrong people get involved. Dr. Whitmore gathered his supplies with the efficiency of someone who had suddenly realized he was complicit in something far larger and more evil than he'd imagined. "There are things I need to tell you about the other children I've treated," he said quietly. "Information that might help you understand what you're really fighting." As evening deepened into night, Holt sat beside Cassie's bed, watching her sleep fitfully through the fever's worst phase. The wooden doll from Emma's room lay clutched in her small hands, and the sight of it filled him with a resolve that burned brighter than any fire he'd ever known. They had taken his Emma from him through poison and treachery, then dared to come. After the child he'd claimed as daughter, the hunting skills that had made him legendary in the territory would serve a different purpose now. But this time, he wouldn't be tracking criminals for money. He'd be destroying the network that had turned children into commodities and families into targets. The brand mark on Cassie's shoulder had revealed the truth about her past, but it had also sealed the fate of everyone responsible for putting it there. Iron Holt Granger was coming out of retirement, and his first case would be his last and deadliest. Holt's modified Winchester rifle lay across the kitchen table like an instrument of divine judgment, its barrel gleaming with the oil he'd applied during the methodical cleaning that helped focus his mind for what lay ahead. Every component had been inspected, every mechanism tested and retested until the weapon felt like an extension of his will rather than merely a tool. The rifle had been his constant companion during his most dangerous hunts, modified with a shorter barrel for close quarters. Work and fitted with a sight that could pick out details at distances that made other hunters shake their heads in disbelief. It represented the pinnacle of his professional skills, the tangible proof that Iron Holt Granger had earned his reputation through precision rather than luck. But this mission would require more than marksmanship. The information Dr. Whitmore had provided painted a picture of an organization far more sophisticated and dangerous than Holt had initially imagined. The trafficking network operated with the efficiency of a military unit, complete with safe houses, supply lines, and corruption reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. The abandoned silver mine 12 miles north of Dustwater Ridge had been their base of operations for over 2 years, according to the doctor's reluctant revelations. Children were held there while arrangements were made for their transport to various destinations across the territory and beyond. The location was perfect for the network's purposes, isolated, defensible, and equipped with existing structures that could be easily modified for containment. "I should have acted sooner," Dr. Whitmore had confessed during their clandestine meeting. "But they made it clear what would happen to my own family if I spoke out. The Marshal himself is involved, Holt. This goes all the way to the territorial capital." The corruption explained why Holt's previous bounty hunting activities had never uncovered the trafficking operation. He'd been hunting individual criminals, while a much larger criminal enterprise operated under the protection of badge and title. The irony wasn't lost on him. His reputation for bringing in wanted men had made him useful to the very people who were profiting from the sale of stolen children. Martha Donovan had insisted on helping with the preparations, her practical nature cutting through Holt's initial reluctance to involve civilians in what was essentially a war declaration. "You'll need someone to look after Cassie while you're gone," she'd argued, with unassailable logic, "and someone to tell your story if you don't come back." The arrangements for Cassie's care during his absence had proven more emotionally difficult. than any tactical planning. The child's fever had broken 2 days earlier, leaving her weak but aware enough to sense the tension that gripped the ranch like a tightening noose. She'd asked no direct questions about his preparations, but her eyes followed his movements with the hypervigilance of someone who'd learned to read danger in adult behavior. The evening before his departure, Cassie had appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding the drawings she'd made of them together. Her small face was pale but determined as she approached his chair and pressed the paper into his hands. "For protection," she said simply, "so you remember to come home to me." The gesture broke something loose in Holt's chest that he'd been keeping. Carefully controlled, he folded the drawing with infinite care and tucked it into his vest pocket next to the tarnished badge that had defined his professional life for so many years. "I promise I'll come back," he told her, the words carrying the weight of an oath sworn before God and witnesses. "And when I do, you'll never have to be afraid of those people again." Sheriff McKenna's late-night visit had provided the final piece of tactical intelligence Holt needed. The lawman arrived under cover of darkness, his conscience finally overriding his fear of the corruption that surrounded them. "There are at least 15 children being held at the mine," McKenna reported quietly. "Maybe more. The guards rotate in shifts, and they're armed with military-grade weapons. This isn't some amateur operation, Holt. These people know what they're doing." The sheriff's face showed the strain of a man who'd spent years looking the other way while evil flourished under his jurisdiction. "I should be going with you," he said, though they both knew his official position made him more liability than asset in a mission that existed entirely outside legal boundaries. "You can help most by making sure Cassie stays safe while I'm gone," Holt replied, "and by being ready to clean up whatever's left when I'm finished." The intelligence gathering had revealed disturbing details about the network's leadership. The Saija operation was directed by someone identified only as the Colonel, a figure whose military background showed in the organizational structure he'd imposed on what was essentially a slave-trading enterprise. The man's identity remained unknown, but his reputation for ruthless efficiency had made the trafficking network the most successful criminal organization in 3 territories. Dr. Whitmore's information had also provided crucial details about the mine's layout and security arrangements. The children were kept in the lower tunnels, areas that had been excavated for silver extraction, but now served as perfect prison cells. Guards were positioned at strategic points throughout the complex, and the entire operation was designed to be abandoned quickly if law enforcement ever mounted a serious investigation. The tactical plan Holt developed drew on every lesson learned during 15 years of hunting the territory's most dangerous criminals. Stealth would be essential in the initial phases. Eliminate the perimeter guards silently, neutralize communication systems, and create confusion about the nature and scope of the attack. Only when the defensive positions had been compromised would direct confrontation become necessary. But beneath the cold calculation of tactical planning lay an emotional current that threatened to overwhelm everything else. The knowledge that Emma had been murdered to facilitate this enterprise, that her death had been nothing more than a business decision made by people who viewed human life as expendable, filled Holt with a rage so pure it felt like a religious experience. The letters he'd written to Cassie lay sealed on his dresser, to be delivered only if he failed to return from the mission. Writing them had forced him to confront the possibility that his desire for vengeance might cost him the chance to see her grow up, to watch her become the strong, educated woman he knew she could be, with proper guidance and protection. But some debts could only be paid in blood, and some evils could only be stopped by men willing to risk everything in service of justice that existed beyond the reach of corrupt courts and compromised officials. Emma's death had created a debt that demanded payment, and Cassie's future security required the elimination of everyone who might seek to reclaim their property. The final night before departure passed in restless preparation. Holt checked and rechecked his equipment, visualized every phase of the assault plan, and tried to anticipate the dozen ways the mission could go catastrophically wrong. His bounty hunting experience had taught him that survival often depended on preparation for scenarios that seemed unlikely but could prove fatal if ignored. Martha arrived at dawn with breakfast and the kind of practical advice that had kept her alive through decades of frontier hardship. "Don't try to be a hero," she told him bluntly. "Just get those children out and come home alive. Cassie needs her papa more than the world needs your martyrdom." The wisdom in her words was undeniable, but Holt knew that the mission's success would require him to become something beyond heroism. He would need to become the avenging angel that Emma's memory demanded and Cassie's future required. The transformation from protector to destroyer was already beginning, visible in the cold calculation that had replaced the warmth usually present in his eyes. As he mounted his horse for the ride to the abandoned mine, Holt felt the weight of Cassie's drawing in his vest pocket and the familiar heft of his rifle across his saddle. The little girl who called him Papa stood in the ranch house doorway, her small figure framed by lamplight like a beacon guiding him towards something worth killing for. The wind carried the scent of approaching winter and the promise of violence that would either liberate 15 children from hell or add one more grave to the territory's growing collection of men who'd tried to fight impossible odds. Either way, by tomorrow's dawn, the trafficking network would learn why Iron Holt Granger had earned his reputation as the most dangerous man in 3 territories. The abandoned mine squatted against the mountainside like a cancer eating into the living rock, its entrance framed by the skeletal remains of equipment that had once pulled silver from the earth. Now it housed a different kind of extraction operation, one that harvested innocence instead of precious metal and counted profit in years of stolen childhood rather than ounces of ore. Holt approached through the pre-dawn darkness, moving with the fluid stealth that had made him legendary. Among his prey, every footstep was calculated, every breath controlled, as he advanced through terrain that could conceal dozens of sentries. The modified Winchester rode easy in his hands, its familiar weight a comfort against the magnitude of what he was attempting. The first guard died without knowing death had found him. The man stood at his post near the mine's main entrance, rifle slung carelessly across his shoulder as he fought the drowsiness that came with the deep watches of the night. Holt's knife took him from behind, sliding between ribs to find the heart with surgical precision. The guard's body settled to the ground with barely a whisper, one less obstacle between Holt and the children trapped in the tunnels below. The compound's layout matched Dr. Whitmore's intelligence exactly. Guard posts positioned to control the approaches, communication lines running between key positions, and multiple escape routes that would allow the leadership to abandon the operation if necessary. But the defensive arrangement had been designed to repel law enforcement raids, not the methodical infiltration of a man who understood the predator's mindset better than his prey understood their own vulnerabilities. The second guard presented a more complex challenge. He patrolled a circuit that brought him past the main entrance every 15 minutes, his routine so precise that Holt could time his movements to the second. When the sentry rounded the corner on his next pass, he found only empty darkness where his partner should have been standing. The moment of confusion was all Holt needed. Another life ended with clinical efficiency, another barrier removed between justice and its targets. Inside the mine's upper tunnels, the evidence of the trafficking operation's scope became immediately apparent. Makeshift cells had been carved from the rock, each equipped with chains and restraints designed to hold the smallest prisoners. The stench of human misery hung in the air like a physical presence, speaking of children forced to exist in conditions that reduced them to their most basic survival instincts. But it was the sound that guided Holt deeper into the mine's bowels, the soft whimpering of voices too young to understand why the adult world had abandoned them to such horror. Following that heartbreaking chorus, He descended through tunnels that grew progressively narrower and more oppressive, until he reached the chamber where the network's current inventory was housed. 15 children huddled in the darkness, their eyes reflecting the small flame of Holt's lantern like those of wild animals caught in torchlight. They ranged in age from perhaps 4 to 12, united by the brand marks that adorned their shoulders and the hollow expressions that spoke of spirits systematically broken by months or years of captivity, the rusty shackles that bound them to. The tunnel walls represented more than mere restraint. They embodied the systematic dehumanization that reduced these children to property in the ledgers of human traffickers. Holt's hands trembled with rage as he began working at the locks with tools designed for more violent purposes, but now repurposed for liberation. "Listen to me carefully," he whispered to the frightened faces turned toward him. "My name is Holt, and I'm here to take you home. But you must stay quiet and do exactly what I tell you. Can you do that?" A few small heads nodded, though fear kept most of the children frozen in place. They had learned that adult promises were usually preludes to greater pain, that hope was a luxury that made disappointment unbearable. But something in Holt's manner, perhaps the gentleness with which he worked at their bonds, or the way his voice carried the authority of protection rather than threat, convinced them to trust this stranger who had emerged from the darkness. Like an answer to prayers they'd stopped believing anyone would hear, the oldest child, a boy whose eyes held wisdom no 12-year-old should possess, spoke in a whisper that barely disturbed the tunnel's oppressive silence. "There are more guards coming. They change watch soon." Holt nodded his understanding while continuing to work at the locks. Time was becoming his enemy. Every minute spent in liberation increased the chances of discovery, but leaving any child behind was unthinkable. The network's system of rotating guards meant his window of opportunity was measured in heartbeats, rather than hours. As each shackle fell away, the children began to show signs of life, returning to bodies that had grown accustomed to captivity. Small hands reached out to touch the walls for support. Legs that had been chained found the strength to bear weight again, and eyes that had grown dim with despair began to reflect something that might eventually become hope. "When I tell you to run," Holt instructed quietly. "Follow this tunnel straight up until you see daylight. Don't stop, don't look back, and don't wait for anyone who falls behind. There are people at the top who will take care of you." It was a lie. No rescue. Party waited above, but these children needed something to run toward rather than simply something to run from. Holt would have to trust that their survival instincts, honed by months of horror, would carry them to safety once they were free of their underground prison. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the tunnels, growing louder with each passing second. Someone was coming to check on the human inventory, and Holt's presence would be discovered within moments. The time for stealth had ended. Now came the part of the mission where survival would depend on violence applied with surgical precision. "Go," he whispered urgently to the freed children. "Run now and don't stop." They vanished into the tunnel's darkness, like ghosts fleeing toward resurrection, their small forms swallowed by shadows that had hidden too much evil for too long. Holt listened to their footsteps fade into silence, then turned his attention to the approaching guards with the cold focus that had made him the territory's most feared bounty hunter. The first guard to enter the chamber died with Holt's knife in his throat before he could raise an alarm. The second managed a strangled cry that echoed through the tunnels like a warning bell, alerting everyone in the complex that their operation had been compromised. From that moment forward, stealth was impossible. The mission had become a race between Holt's determination and the network's desperation to preserve their criminal enterprise. Gunfire erupted in the tunnels as more guards converged on the children's former prison. Muzzle flashes illuminated the rocky walls in brief, violent intervals while bullets sparked off stone and filled the air with deadly fragments. Holt moved through the chaos with deadly purpose, his modified Winchester speaking with mechanical precision as he eliminated anyone who stood between him and the surface. The children's escape route had been discovered. He could hear shouts and running footsteps as guards attempted to intercept the fleeing prisoners. Some would be recaptured, others might reach safety, but all of them now had a chance that hadn't existed an hour earlier. Whatever happened next, Holt had succeeded in shattering the network's sense of invulnerability. The golden locket that had belonged to Emma pressed against Holt's chest as he fought his way through the mine's upper tunnels, its small weight serving as both talisman and reminder of why this mission had become necessary. Every step toward the surface brought him closer to the confrontation that would determine whether justice was possible in a world where children could be branded like cattle and sold to the highest bidder. The network's leadership had barricaded themselves in the mine's administrative office, a reinforced structure that had once housed the Silver Operations Management but now served as command center for human trafficking across 3 territories. From this position, they could control access to the main entrance while coordinating the recapture of escaped prisoners and the elimination of whoever had dared to challenge their operations. Marshal Thompson emerged from the office with the confidence of a man accustomed to authority, his badge gleaming in the lamplight as he surveyed the chaos Holt had unleashed. The sight of him wearing the star of territorial law enforcement while orchestrating the sale of children struck Holt. Like a physical blow, corruption had not only enabled this enterprise, but had provided it with official protection. "Iron Holt Granger," Thompson called out, his voice carrying across the tunnel with practiced authority. "I should have known you'd eventually stumble into something too big for you to handle." The Marshal's recognition confirmed what Holt had begun to suspect. His retirement from bounty hunting had been monitored by the same criminal network that had murdered Emma to eliminate a potential threat. Thompson knew him not as a stranger, but as an obstacle that had been neutralized through grief and isolation. "You killed my daughter," Holt stated with deadly calm, his rifle trained on the man who wore justice's badge while trafficking in stolen innocence. Thompson's laugh was ugly and dismissive. "Your Emma was collateral damage, nothing more. We needed you broken and distracted while we established our operations in this territory. A grieving father posed much less risk than an active bounty hunter." The casual admission of Emma's murder crystallized every emotion Holt had been carrying for 3 years into a single burning point of righteous fury. The fever that had taken his daughter hadn't been the random cruelty of nature. It had been deliberate murder, designed to clear the way for the systematic exploitation of other children. "You poisoned a 5-year-old girl to protect your business interests," Holt said, his voice carrying the promise of retribution that had made hardened criminals choose surrender over facing him in the field. "I did what was necessary to protect." "A profitable enterprise," Thompson replied without remorse, "just as I'm about to do now." The Marshal's hand moved toward his weapon with the speed that had earned him his reputation as a gunfighter, but Holt's response was faster, the product of 15 years spent facing men who lived by violence and died by the same code. Thompson's shot went wide, sparking off the tunnel wall in a shower of stone fragments, while Holt's bullet found its target with surgical precision. Marshal Thompson died as he had lived, betraying the oath he'd sworn to protect the innocent while profiting from their suffering. The badge that had given him authority to commit evil with impunity clattered to the ground beside his body, its tarnished surface reflecting the lamplight like a fallen star. But Thompson's death revealed the scope of evidence that documented the trafficking network's operations across multiple territories. Ledgers filled with children's names and ages, correspondence with buyers in distant cities, financial records that traced payments through corrupt officials, all the proof needed to dismantle an organization that had operated under law enforcement. Protection for years, the surviving guards surrendered rather than face the man who had just eliminated their leadership with clinical efficiency. They understood, as all criminals eventually learned, that Iron Holt Granger's reputation had been earned through encounters where resistance meant death and submission offered the only chance of survival. As dawn broke over the mountainside, the last of the freed children emerged from the mine's depths, blinking in sunlight they had thought they might never see again. 15 young lives had been liberated from hell, though the scars they carried would require years of healing to overcome. Some would find loving families willing to help them recover. Others would struggle with the trauma of their experiences for the rest of their lives. But all of them now had what they had been systematically denied, the possibility of a future that extended beyond the narrow confines of criminal exploitation. The rusty shackles lay broken in the tunnels below, their power to reduce human beings to property, forever ended by a man who understood that some evils could only be stopped through violence applied in service of justice. Holt gathered the networks, records with methodical care, knowing that the information they contained would be essential for prosecuting the remaining conspirators and identifying other children who might still be held elsewhere. The trafficking operation had tentacles that reached across state lines and into the highest levels of territorial government, but those connections would now become liabilities rather than protections. Emma's death had finally been avenged, though. No amount of justice could restore what had been lost. The locket pressed against his chest felt lighter somehow, as if the completion of his mission had lifted a weight that had burdened him since that terrible autumn morning 3 years earlier. The photographer's camera captured a moment that would define Dustwater Ridge's transformation from a place where children were sold like cattle to a community where they were cherished like precious gifts. In the formal portrait, Holt sat with quiet dignity while Cassie stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder with the natural affection of a daughter who had never known fear in her father's presence. The new family photograph would replace the daguerreotype of his former life, not as an act of forgetting, but as a testament to love's ability to heal even the deepest wounds. Emma's memory lived on in the care he showed Cassie and in the refuge he'd created for other children who had survived the trafficking network's systematic cruelty. 6 months had passed since the mine raid that liberated 15 children and exposed corruption reaching into the territorial capital. The evidence Holt had recovered led to arrests and prosecutions that dismantled criminal operations across 3 states. Earning him recognition as a hero despite his preference for the quiet life he'd built with Cassie. Dustwater Ridge's attitude toward Holt had undergone a complete reversal. The townspeople who had once whispered cruel speculation about his motives now spoke of him with respect, approaching reverence. The man they'd called dangerously unpredictable had proven himself to be exactly what the community needed. Someone willing to risk everything to protect the innocent from predators who wore badges and spoke with authority. Judge Harrison had expedited the formal adoption proceedings with an efficiency that spoke to his shame over the legal system's failure. To protect vulnerable children, the papers that made Cassie legally and permanently Holt's daughter carried official seals and signatures. But the bonds they formalized had been forged through shared trauma and mutual devotion rather than bureaucratic process. "She's fortunate to have found you," the judge had said during the brief ceremony that finalized their family status. "And from what I've observed, you're equally fortunate to have found her." The ranch had expanded to accommodate its new role as a sanctuary for children recovering from trafficking trauma. 3 of the liberated children had come to live with Holt and Cassie, forming an unconventional family united by their understanding of what it meant to survive evil and choose to trust again. The house that had once echoed with solitary grief now rang with the sounds of childhood, laughter and arguments, questions and discoveries, the daily chaos of young lives learning to hope. Martha Donovan's saloon had been transformed into a temporary orphanage and adoption center, connecting rescued children with families throughout the territory who had volunteered to provide homes. Her practical wisdom and maternal instincts made her the perfect coordinator for placing traumatized children with people capable of providing the patience and understanding they needed. Dr. Whitmore had dedicated himself to providing medical care for trafficking survivors, using his knowledge of their physical and psychological needs to develop treatment protocols that other physicians across the territory could follow. His guilt over years of silence had been channeled into advocacy that ensured no doctor would again have to choose between speaking out and protecting their own family. Sheriff McKenna's transformation from reluctant observer to active protector had earned him the respect of a community that finally understood the difference between law enforcement and justice. His coordination with federal authorities had led to the arrests of corrupt officials whose protection had enabled the trafficking network to operate with impunity for years. The annual celebration honoring the rescued children had become Dustwater, Ridge's most important community event, drawing visitors from across the territory who came to witness a town's commitment to protecting its most vulnerable residents. Cassie, now confident and articulate, had become an unofficial spokesperson for survivors, her speeches combining childish wisdom with insights that moved hardened adults to tears. Papa Holt taught me that families aren't just about blood, she would tell the assembled crowds. They're about people who choose to take care of each other no matter what. Holt's reputation had evolved from Iron Holt the bounty hunter to something far more meaningful. Papa Holt, the man who proved that violence applied in service of love could transform communities and save lives. His occasional absences from the ranch were now motivated by rescue missions rather than profit, using his skills to liberate children from similar operations discovered across the territory. The children who shared their home had grown strong. Under Cassie's protective influence and Holt's patient guidance, she had appointed herself their teacher and advocate, helping them learn to read and write while showing them that adults could be trusted to keep their promises. Her natural intelligence had been enhanced by education, making her a formidable young lady who commanded respect from people twice her age. Emma's room had been converted into a library where all the children could gather for story time. The Tasha space finally serving its intended purpose as a place where young minds could explore worlds beyond their immediate experience. The wooden doll sat on a place of honor among newer toys, a bridge between past and present that reminded everyone how love could survive loss and create new beginnings. As Holt sat on his porch, watching Cassie teach the younger children to ride, he reflected on the journey that had brought them all together. The wind still blew across the prairie with relentless persistence, but it no longer carried the weight of solitary grief. Instead, it brought the sounds of children at play, the promise of futures filled with possibility, and the peace that came from knowing that sometimes broken people could heal each other simply by choosing to care. The man who had once been defined by the violence he could inflict had discovered a more lasting legacy in the love he could provide. In saving Cassie, he had saved himself, and in building their family, he had created something that would endure long after the frontier's harsh realities had been tamed by civilization's advance.